Mary Eleanor Wheeler was born on 26 March 1866 in Kent to James Wheeler and his wife Charlotte Ann. When she was a toddler, she was dropped and hit her head, complaining for weeks that it hurt and often complained of headaches. She went on to suffer from epilepsy, although whether the fall was a contributory factor is unknown. She was joined by her sister Amelia in 1868, although she died in 1871, and another sister, Charlotte, was born in 1871. 3 brothers followed: James, Charles, and John. By this time the family had moved to Stepney in London. When Mary was a teenager, she began working for her uncle, John Kelly, in his newsagents. She then went to work for a German family, the Prumers, as a nurse to the newborn son, George. But her fits grew worse, so they dismissed her in the summer of 1882. A month later, her father died, and a few months after that, she tried to take her own life, one of several attempts. She would tell people that she'd been married to a well-off young man in Piccadilly, but the place she claimed that this had happened simply didn't exist, and there was no record of any marriage. She met John Charles Pearcey, a carpenter, and the two lived together, although they were never married, but she used his surname. Soon, Pearcey discovered she not only told elaborate stories about her life, but that she'd been unfaithful to him, so he ended the relationship. She then met furniture remover Frank Samuel Hogg when she was 19, but it was a complicated relationship, as he had a wife, Phoebe Styles, and a baby daughter, also called Phoebe, but known as Tiggy. Phoebe had fallen pregnant to Hogg, and in those days it was expected that marriage would follow. He, in turn, also believed Mary was married to Pearcey. Nonetheless, Mary and Frank began their intimate affair shortly after his marriage to Phoebe in November 1888. By 1890, Mary was living at 2 Priory Street in London, between Camden Road and Kentish Town Road. Frank lived nearby in Prince of Wales Road. According to newspaper reports, Mary had led an immoral life in that she'd been a sex worker, but with Frank, something changed in her. She wrote him love letters, but it seems she never asked him to leave his wife or to stop sleeping with her. She even met Phoebe and looked after her during a bout of illness in February 1890, but Mary never visited her again after this. By October that year, Phoebe had become suspicious that Frank and Mary were having an affair. The marriage was in difficulties, with the pair having temporarily separated, but they got back together. It was also around this time Mary was suffering from persistent headaches that lasted for days, possibly brought on by stress. Frank decided to end the relationship with Mary on 22nd October. On Thursday, 23rd October, Mary sent a message boy with a note to Phoebe and invited her to tea the following afternoon. Surprisingly, Phoebe accepted, and along with little Tiggy, walked to Priory Street, happily pushing the baby in her pram. She was led into the back kitchen and suddenly attacked. It was brutal. She had her skull smashed in with a poker, then had her throat cut, all carried out by Mary. Neighbours later confirmed that at around 4 p.m, they'd heard screams coming from the house. Mary somehow managed to drag the body and place it in the perambulator on top of the baby. She then left the house, pushing it towards a railway arch at the end of the street and out into the dark streets of the city. A few hours later, Phoebe's body was discovered abandoned on a pile of rubbish in Crossfield Road, with little attempt to hide the remains. Police were called, with Inspector Wright and Dr. Wells arriving at the scene. Dr. Wells believed the victim hadn't been dead long. The black pram was found about a mile away, with its cushions covered in blood. 18-month-old Tiggy was found 2 days later behind a hedge on Finchley Road by Oliver Smith. Her cause of death was suspected to be either from being smothered or from exposure. On Sunday, 2nd November, Phoebe and her daughter were buried together at Finchley Cemetery. Mary was swiftly arrested on suspicion of murder, as she'd been seen pushing the pram that night by witnesses. Police searched the house and found blood spatter on the walls, ceiling, and matted hair and blood on the poker, as well as on a carving knife. When asked by police what had gone on, Mary told them she had a problem with mice and was trying to kill them. At the Central Criminal Court, better known as the Old Bailey, in London, on Monday, 1st December 1890, Mary stood before Justice George Denman, charged with murdering Phoebe Hogg and her daughter, Phoebe Hanslope Hogg. James Forrest Fulton and Mr. G.F. Gill led the prosecution case. Mary, who was transported to the court from Holloway Prison, was defended by Arthur Hutton and pleaded not guilty. Hogg himself was at one stage thought to have been involved in the murder of his wife and child, but he was exonerated from any wrongdoing in the affair. He had accounted for his whereabouts that Friday, and when he arrived home and his wife and child weren't there, he simply thought they'd gone to Chorley Wood, where Phoebe's father lay ill. As the evidence was presented, it transpired Mary claimed that as they were having tea, Phoebe Hogg had said something she didn't like. The dead woman had been hit on the back of the head with the poker, then hit again, another twice. Then the head was severed by several cuts. Hogg revealed he had a latchkey to the Priory Street property and could let himself in whenever he liked, but the relationship ended 2 days before the murder took place. Dr. Bond told the court the kitchen floor of the property had been recently cleaned and scratches were found on the back of Mary's hands. Another doctor, Dr. Pepper, told the court of the injuries sustained to Phoebe. Mary was clearly suffering from some kind of mental disorder, but doctors concluded she was sane enough to stand trial. She maintained her innocence throughout. On 3rd December 1890, 24-year-old Mary was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. During her incarceration, only her mother, her sister, and her solicitor, Frederick Frake Palmer, visited her. Her execution took place at 8 o'clock on the morning of Tuesday 23rd December at Newgate Prison. James Berry, the executioner, later said she was the most composed person of all those involved in her execution that day. When asked to make her last statement, she stated, My sentence is a just one, but a good deal of the evidence against me was false. She was buried in the prison cemetery in an unmarked grave.